Hello, welcome everyone. I am very pleased to be with you today. I see many people still dropping in, and I will admit one by one, obviously. But in the meantime, while you wait for others to come in, please turn off and keep off your camera, but also your microphone. Feel free to type questions in the chat box. And you can ask questions. I would love to have some questions, but after the presentation is over. So basically, at the end of all the sessions, I'd be more than happy to engage and to have a Q&A. But I would like you to type them all in the chat box. If you have anything in between that you think is important to flag, yeah, just type it, and I'll come back to that then later. Just for now, I'm very curious if you can all hear me all right and see the presentation move from the main page that you see now and moving into the next one. So if any one of you can give me a thumbs up, that would be much appreciated. Thank you, excellent. Perfect. Thank you and welcome all. Thank you. In the meantime, I'll keep an eye on admitting people, so I may be looking a little bit in between. I hope you don't mind. Right, we're going to kick this off. This is the webinar, workshop, course on policies and regulations on behalf of the IGA Academy, which is part, of course, of the International Geothermal Association, our global platform for all matters geothermal. And what I would like to cover this afternoon is a couple of things. One is, of course, I give an introduction on policies and regulations and specifically definitions. There will be a lot of terms flying around and flowing around. I have a glossary at the end of the pack. You will all be sent this material, and feel free to read through and to comment also later on when you think, oh, you probably missed this, or I would like to have a second look at that. Do not mind to send me any type of feedback. But as said, there will be a lot of definitions and hence I prepared a glossary for you to browse through towards the end. So don't mind if something is unclear, or if you thought, oh, I would really like to have more information on that. I like to split it in two parts before the break. One is policies. What do we mean with it? What are they? Where are they? And how people are living by them. And second part is regulations. After that, a small break, depending, of course, a little bit on where we stand time-wise. After the break, I throw in some examples, especially for those who are very unfamiliar yet with policies and regulations, so you get a bit of an overview of how other countries are targeting them and what works. And then let's dive into some Q&A. Thank you. So first of all, me, for those in the room who don't know me, my day job is not teaching policies and regulations, but actually talking to a lot of people about geothermal energy, whether that comes from the policy side or the regulatory side, but also in general, what is geothermal? I'm the CEO at IGA. I am the daily management, basically in charge of daily management and operations of the IGA. My personal background is I'm a geologist. I come from oil and gas originally, but I am a big fan of geothermal, and I just want to see more of it done across the world. My observation, 8 years that I'm doing it, I love it all. Every piece of geothermal, whether we go deep or shallow, or whether we are drilling for, let's call that low temperature or hot temperature, steam fields or sedimentary aquifers, I think it all has its place and it deserves its place in the energy mix. What I have noticed is that one of the key blocking points is that there are not enough coherent, robust, sustainable policy frameworks, either because people are unaware of it, so that's one aspect, but also regulatory wise, it almost often a project gets stuck in the pipeline when there is not enough knowledge on how to regulate geothermal, and whether that is the subsurface or the surface, and we'll come to that in this overview as well. So I call myself a geothermal advocate, but one disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. I do not come from the legislative space. So if you need, or your project, or in your country, if you need some specific legal advice, I am not the one. Of course, we have many people working with us within the wider IGA umbrella who can definitely help. This course is really intended to give a flavor of what works, how countries have organized themselves, how certain governments are taking the approach towards legislation, regulation, and the policies, and hence see this as an overview, as a summary of best practices in order to equip yourself to go to the next step. Thank you for that. So the introduction on policies and regulations, and of course a little bit on geothermal as well. And I hope you don't mind, especially if you are from the geothermal space, it is still important to understand how the legislative guys and girls at the other side of the table, how they legislate geothermal. Hence definitions are key. The words that are used to define and to write about, but also to legislate, is all depending on how we interpret geothermal, and I hope it will come through as one of the main messages during this course. When we talk about policies, the definition is as follows, as you can see on the screen. And that is that it's a course of action, or it's a principle that's adopted by government or any type of institution. Policy can, of course, also be a company adopting a policy, or an institution adopting a policy to achieve specific objectives. And they are often, of course, outlined. They are official documents, and they are implemented. So policies are implemented through law, and hence the regulations. So it's key to understand policies and the instruments that specifically government use to implement policies include regulations, but also financial incentives. There are market mechanisms, voluntary agreements. Those are the instruments people can use to implement those policies. So it's a very important definition. At the highest legislative legislation stage, the primary stage is the law, basically, and they are enacted by the governing body, for instance, Parliament or Congress, however that's organized in your specific jurisdictions. And the law regulates specific sectors, including geothermal, but they also govern, for instance, environmental protection and taxation. So basically the market elements. So the primary law, the primary act is super important because that forms, if you like, the umbrella under which the regulatory frameworks hang. So it all has to come together. The regulations, basically sitting underneath that, are the legal rules. And they are established by your government or by an authority, if this is about a municipality or a provincial department, to control, of course, to control the policies, but also to guide and to manage specific activities. And they ensure, so basically the regulatory framework ensures the compliance with law, and hence the policies. So they come together and they form a framework, and that is the structure. That's basically the structured, the backbone, if you like, often a set of legal, procedural, institutional rules, and they govern a particular sector, such as, again, for us in geothermal. And they ensure health and safety, sustainability, and again, the compliance of it all. Geothermal energy. For those of you who are already working in geothermal energy, it is of course crystal clear what the geothermal resource is. I often come, of course, in countries or in projects where it's all quite new, and where the legislators or the policy makers are not quite sure what it is that geothermal energy well, from a legal point of view is. And hence it is important that we all appreciate and standardize in this sense also a little bit geothermal resources and what it is. And hence this is a definition that seems to be applicable worldwide, wherever you are and wherever you stand. So it's heat, energy, stored beneath the Earth's surface and is derived from the natural decay of radioactive materials and residual heat, okay? And then the purpose of geothermal energy, regardless where you stand, used for heating, for cooling, for electricity, and mineral extraction. And it's important, this purpose, because if you really look, and we'll dive deeper into this, if you really look how geothermal is regulated and how that primary act is enabled upon, it often comes down to steam, hot water, or vapor even, or mineral, or just heat. And this may sound very nuanced, and it is nuanced. So it is super important to understand, especially when you want to advise your governments or your local authorities, what it is that you're regulating and trying to legislate. Try to understand it as a classification, such as steam, such as hot water, such as minerals or heat, because it has a major impact on how geothermal gets done. There's no best practice in terms of only classify it as hot water. It's better than classified as mineral. That's not the point. It is just super important to realize that there are multiple ways to classify geothermal energy and that it has impact on your overarching policy and regulatory framework. So as a recap for this introduction, so at the primary level, that where the acts are living, this is your umbrella, if you like. Everything will hang under your umbrella, and those acts, I will come to that later in the session. It ranges from country to country what primary act you want to act upon. So certain countries have adopted geothermal energy under the Energy Act or under the mining law or under the water law, or specific countries have Geothermal Resources Act because they thought it was so important that they have defined a specific act on it. Also, there are some countries who have more or less targeted geothermal under environmental protection, and hence their primary act sits more under sustainability, biodiversity, and the environment. And on the secondary level, so basically level number 2 that hangs under the umbrella, that's where all your regulations sit. Permitting, licensing, fiscal, economic, technical, safety, social, but also how you distribute your pipes, your infrastructure, your grid transmissions, and also institutional and governance. Who's governing geothermal and who is ultimately responsible for getting the clean and firm power or clean, firm heat towards the customers. With that, maybe a couple of examples to make it a little bit more tangible for those in the room. I listed a couple of countries on the bottom line, so on the x-axis, and they range from Costa Rica, New Zealand, Kenya, Türkiye, all the way to my own home country, the Netherlands, but of course also China. And later in the course, we're also going to see the differences between the acts that have been adopted by the countries, specifically more, let's say more for electricity, so high enthalpy and the resources around that, or more the direct utilization, heating and cooling. And as you can see from this specific picture already, there is no one size fits all. There is no one type of act that works for one type of country. They all seem to be dealing with geothermal differently, but it works. And I think that is also one of the main messages. It works, but you have to be specific because it comes down to the words you're using in those acts. So for instance, Costa Rica is, to my knowledge at least, one of the few countries who is enacting geothermal under the environmental protection law. There are a couple of countries who are taking mining, the mining law, as the primary act under which they govern and regulate geothermal, and that is Kenya and Turkey. New Zealand and Iceland have Geothermal Resources Acts. They are the two countries that are specifically targeting geothermal with one specific act. And a dedicated act. So no mining, no water, geothermal resources. The countries who are more dealing with geothermal from a what we would call low temperature or mid temperature and hence a direct utilization of geothermal are more looking into specifically renewable energy. They are targeting, and that is also reflecting on they're newer in the game for geothermal. They're looking at geothermal via renewable energy acts, or even specifically heat laws, such as Germany and the Netherlands, who have specifically adopted geothermal to be enacted upon by a specific heat law. And China came from water, so they have been looking at geothermal as the main act to adhere to as the water law, but also framed it under the renewable energy, and hence they have a combined act, renewable energy and water law. As a short summary statement, in geothermal development, the Act sets the legal framework, your umbrella. The regulations define the procedures. So I know it sounds repetitive maybe, but I feel that this is important, especially for those who are unfamiliar yet with policies and regulations. It's very important to make a distinction between the two. The Act is the legal framework. That's your big umbrella. Regulations sit underneath and they define the procedures you have to follow up and make it compliant too. With that, we're going to dive into our next step, and that is policies. So the coming 50 minutes, bear with me, we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about policies in geothermal. As a side note, I hope you have all seen it, read it maybe even. I'm very curious, of course, also about your own observations on it. But the IEA, so the International Energy Agency, released late last year, so 24, end of the quarter, the Future of Geothermal report, very detailed on the potential of geothermal on all kinds of layers and technologies. For me, what I thought was quite interesting, because this is also the work that IGA is trying to promote more and more worldwide, is that we lack, if I'm honest, we totally lack, let's say, full commitment worldwide from a policy and hence regulatory framework point of view. Well, the enabling frameworks, to say it mildly, for geothermal energy, because only 10% of the countries worldwide have active policies on geothermal and or an active regulatory framework. So if you come from a country that at the moment is emerging, or maybe even you have an established market in geothermal and you still think, oh, it's not coherent enough, you are not alone. I'm not saying that wind and solar is doing it better, but I think it is more coherent, it's more robust, it's more standardized. Anyway, I thought it was quite an interesting study. And also, of course, it gives more detail to those countries that have good practices, best practices, and the ones who can learn from that. So it's a good report as well from that side to read. I'm taking a little bit of an international step and then towards national, let's say, frameworks when it comes down to targets and policies. Why I'm doing that is not just because I represent the International Geothermal Association. It is important. It is important to understand that there is an international world and international space that is having big agendas or big priorities or big targets. And the more aligned national governments are with those priority goals and priority targets, the easier it is to guide geothermal in that dialogue and in those conversations. Now, for us, and I know this is my own big topic, of course, are the NDCs. So those are the national determined contributions. They come from the UN priority agenda on sustainable development goals. but also, of course, the climate accord that was signed in 2015 to reduce CO2 emissions. And the majority of governments, and this year is a big year because all the governments are going to be asked to resubmit and reshape their NDCs. So COP30 in Belém in Brazil, those NDCs will be ratified. Now, hopefully every NDC will be submitted and carried by their governments. I appreciate it's disruptive times, but I still keep on pushing for this. And typical policy targets in the NDCs are like, we want to, as government, reduce CO2 emissions by a certain percentage in a certain timeline. 50% by 2050 is typically what governments put in there. From that Paris Accord, but also in general, more and more under the Renewable Energy Act, you see typical policy targets are rising. Something like 50% of my national domestic electricity should come and must come from renewables by 2050. And it's a very good, let's say, guideline and target for geothermal to embark on and say, look, and within that target, we deliver an X amount of electricity as well. So see this as little hooks you can guide your government with. And the importance is to realize that geothermal sits in there and has a role to play and can help governments to achieve their own national targets when it comes down to international coherent frameworks. What you see more and more, and I guess that's also part of the disruption of this day and age, is that energy security becomes primary acts for governments to live by and to be compliant with. And energy security is often framed around affordability, as in providing more and more clean, firm power. SDG 7 says it also has to be affordable, and hence the clean, firm power needs to be as cheap as possible, or at least as affordable as possible for the people. In certain cases, that is part of reducing fossil fuel reliance, and hence there are specific targets under Energy Security Act that says reliance by an X amount of, let's say 40% at a certain time frame, and hence we independent, and with that we diversify our energy mix. And these are all super important for geothermal and also for our community to realize that by shaping the conversation with your national government that geothermal can help their national targets, it is so much easier to have that conversation. Okay, let's legislate it now in the correct way. So how can geothermal policies contribute towards achieving national targets? This is what others have done before, and let's look at how we can shape a more coherent discussion on this. The link between, and why maybe for those who are unfamiliar yet with these kind of high-level policies, the alignment between the targets and the national policies, you can make a nice little diagram on the right-hand side. As you can see, the better alignment, the stronger your policy strength is. And hence, what you see with certain countries is that they have a specific target and they centered their national policy, let's say, information around that target, and hence their policy strength becomes super centered. And hence, typical are countries like Costa Rica in geothermal. This is geothermal. This is mapped for geothermal that has a strong renewable energy targets, but also have the policies enacted upon to achieve the targets. So in the top quadrant, Iceland, Costa Rica, but also China, New Zealand, Indonesia, they're all part of that sort of right top end quadrant. If you're somewhere here in the bottom, as in the left side, it means neither do you have a target nor do you have any policy. So I thought I will not put it in there. It makes it's not very nice to point out. I want to mention two specific countries. One, because we are working a lot with Canada these days due to World Geothermal Congress next year. It's an emerging geothermal country. There's no doubt it's all new. There are hints of new projects. It's getting there. It's all pioneering, and hopefully, of course, after World Geothermal Congress, but also all the work that is going to be done in the coming 2 to 3 years, we will see more frameworks allowing geothermal to be boosted and to be acted upon. Canada has good renewable targets. It wants to diversify. Of course, it's a very heavy fossil fuel country. Predominantly gas is quite cheap. But their policy is, relatively speaking, for renewables weak, meaning that they don't have any acts really to act upon, and hence the whole regulatory framework is still very rising, it's upcoming, and it needs to be shaped. Hence, they are sitting here on the left end. Now, Norway, European country Norway, is a complete different story. They have hardly any target. They just continue doing what they're doing. But they are almost 90% of their heating, for instance, comes from either geothermal or green fuels or biomass. And that is because their policies are super strong. So regardless of having then, super nice targets in the highest level, their policies are centered around getting the job done. And hence, maybe they are not part of this nice upper right quadrant, but Norway gets the job done. So please see this diagram as an opportunity to be in the top quadrant, but also there are countries who are just super good at it because their policy works. Over to geothermal countries and to understand where you sit and what kind of policies shape geothermal development. What I've noticed is that geothermal policies are obviously, but are in geothermal still very much related to market design and the market readiness. And hence, typically you can break geothermal countries down in 4 different categories, and you can see where their policy shift is going to, or where they're, especially in emerging countries, where they need to focus on. So the 4 categories are, you can have an emerging country, a developing country, a mature country, and of course, the more advanced you are with geothermal, you are becoming a global leader. Emerging means minimal or no development, such as Canada, for instance, is an emerging country. Developing, some development, but still much unlocked potential. Mature, established, advanced global leaders, and you see there countries are maturing beyond electricity, and hence they are looking at foreign policy, they're looking at direct utilization beyond their primary drive, etc., etc. There are 2 types of instruments, and I think this is key as well to understand our policy instruments in the toolkits that we have. Emerging and developing markets need to target risk reduction, because without risk reduction policies, geothermal is not going to happen. So what you tend to see in emerging countries, but also still in developing markets, is they address exploration uncertainty and upfront capital risk. So every design that countries do or that authorities do around enabling geothermal on that high level act is all about risk reduction. Whilst if you look at matured and advancing countries, you see more and more they build remuneration policies in their toolkit, and hence they ensure long-term financial viability, but also attract more capital to build out. And hence investor confidence becomes primary focus of those policy instruments. And to dive a little bit deeper into this topic, main policy goals for emerging geothermal markets. They are here to reduce upfront risks and to attract initial investment. And think about this as, for instance, these are worldwide tools that we have mapped. If you happen to be from one of these countries, please give me some feedback if this is still correct or right, or if you want to see it changed. More than happy to take your feedback. Kenya is a government-backed insurance. Kenya's geothermal risk mitigation facility, it works. Publicly funded exploration, resource mapping to get that initial risk out of the way. Indonesia is a classic example for what works. Technical capacity building support, especially in developing countries, support by World Bank, for instance, support by training and international cooperation. The Japanese have these kind of incentives. The JICA framework, for instance, helping governments from a technical point of view, but also from an international cooperation. But also think here bilateral. There are super nice bilateral frameworks between countries to help each other and to lift each other. And it's all about getting those upfront risks out of the way. But equally help and support around regulatory framework development, understanding the licensing, the permits, environmental regulations, if that is still a point of concern, how geothermal can benefit, but also may have a need for mitigation for environmental downsides when people are concerned about that. You need to build that in the early stage risk mitigation pack. So that's the main policy goal for emerging geothermal markets. And what you tend to see more and more in those stage 2 countries or governments is more and more their target finance, and they want to accelerate project development. So think about a 50-50 split between, okay, we have reduced risk, but now we're going to look in remuneration. So feed-in tariffs, power purchase agreements, government co-financing, loan guarantees. That's all part of scaling up, and you have some manifestation of geothermal, but now you want to move bigger. What you also tend to see is that the one-stop geothermal licensing process becomes on top of the government's mind. Fast-tracking permits. Often the permitting side is the biggest delay and dropping investor confidence or dropping the developers' pockets, because not every investor of course, has deep pockets to sustain a long permitting process, and hence the need for speed is super important. But also more and more in this stage, the governments are looking into how can it best be integrated? How does geothermal integrate in my overall energy strategy? And hence ensuring that geothermal plays a bigger part, a broader part in the energy mix. Or, very popular these days, is the decarbonization strategies. Moving into a more mature market, this is where you want to expand. This is where you want to move beyond electricity. When you haven't done already, for instance, you are primarily acting upon electricity. Now you see an opportunity in developing low enthalpy or cascading use of it. You see that the main policy goal is shifting towards expansion, to do everything with geothermal, to integrate it more in the energy strategy, write policy plans around grid expansion and how geothermal can balance the grid, for instance. It all becomes part of a mature thinking and a mature policy kit. Now here we see, of course, tax credits coming in, innovation, R&D. This is where you see renewable energy portfolio standards coming in. Utilities taking either their public utilities or they are in PPP, public-private partnership, with clear targets. So, for instance, I want to procure as utility company an X% of clean power from renewable sources, and I have to deliver that, and I get some premium pricing for that. It's all part of a mature market, basically. And of course, more towards those countries that have district heating or direct use support, you see that that's the primary focus. For instance, infrastructure focus, building up heating networks. It's all targeting to delivering geothermal at the end user in broader and bigger scale. And what you tend to see with advanced geothermal countries, and let's be honest, there are only a handful, or if we have a handful even in geothermal. But what you tend to see with those governments who are very happy with their domestic geothermal energy, they tend to think about moving beyond domestic and going global, going international, so they have foreign policy around it, export policy or technology export policy. But also what you tend to see is there's innovation happening, supercritical, deep drilling, heat storage, AI. It all becomes part of the buzzwords around the new upcoming, geothermal promise. And hence it's all about expansion. It's all about new applications, and the policy toolkit sits around that. And interesting is, of course, export-oriented policies, because then, I mean, that's a matter, in the whole metric of how advanced geothermal is. You can measure how mature the technology is as soon as it becomes export and hence foreign policy and trade, and see this as an incentive to diversify other countries and helping to diversify other countries' energy mixes, then you become much more mature as a technology in general. And hence, my personal goal is, of course, to see more countries becoming so advanced that they are exporting geothermal as part of their foreign policy. With that, maybe a short summary statement on what type of policies work, but also split around the stages geothermal project developers are. So I took all the type of policies, risk reduction, remuneration, and split it across where you stand when you are developing project for the first time. And of course, it needs to be matched with the country that you are developing it in. So what you tend to see is when you're into stage 1, exploration and resource assessments, this is where you need your risk to be reduced. And hence, risk reduction policies will all help you to develop your project, especially in an emerging market. So in a country with nothing on the ground and you are a new developer, please have a look with your government or with your association, your national association, or with IGA or with your regional bodies, but have a look at how you can build policies like all the risk reduction policies around exploration and risk sharing, PPPs, geological mapping in your government, because it will help you. Second step, when it's about drilling and testing those wells and testing the wells for the resources, it all becomes it's still risk reduction, but it all becomes very specific. It all becomes very centered around getting that first well drilled. And hence the insurance industry comes here. I mean, most wells are drilling that first well is for most countries the most difficult thing to do. Once you're drilled, everyone comes in, right? It's getting to finance close on that first well. Cost sharing, concessional loans, tax incentives, it all helps, and it reduces the risk for the one and only party that is going to go forward with it. In construction and commissioning, you tend to see that there are two types of policies kicking in. Tax credits, climate financing, public infrastructure, it's all very clear that it helps to reduce risk. But the remuneration side, the feed-in tariffs, contracts for differences, those kind of policies help to build up and to commission and get the electrons to the transmission lines or the heat into the pipelines. These type of policies work. When you're in operation and you have done, of course, all these stages successfully, and people are happy, and you're thinking more about advancing and expanding and going bigger and integration, it's all about remuneration. It's not just the risk is there still, sure, don't get me wrong, but it's not about risk anymore in operation stage. It's about expanding, and hence you need policies that center around that. And to my knowledge, so far decommissioning is not really our game. There are, of course, repurposing and expansion and extension of projects, sidetracks to be drilled, completion to be done, and hence repurposing or for circular economy policies. They are very popular these days for some premium carbon credits to incentivize maybe other investors to come into your play to help repurposing or going beyond what you were currently producing. It falls again back towards risk reduction because you still have to apply for new capital. So, as a key takeaway for this session, emerging market is all about reducing risk. Developing markets is all about financing. Mature markets, they are looking into integration. And advanced markets go broader and want to innovate, do R&D, and expand to other international markets. So when it comes down to the policy kits, remember where you sit, understand how you can help governments, but also how you can advise and be that advocate for your policy toolkit. And of course, if you want to move, that's the biggest thing, of course, from zero to something. Please remember, reduce risk is your key priority, and then financing will flow. With that, I'm moving to the second part in the coming, let's say, 50 minutes, and take a deeper dive into regulations, after which I will give you some free time, a couple of minutes, 10 minutes for a small break before we dive into examples and Q&A. So bear with me, and let's look into what we mean with regulations in geothermal. Before we dive into regulations, and of course, if you are from the legal side, you know where I'm getting into. If you are not from the legal side, I think this is the most important thing to discuss before we understand our regulators well. And that is what we have found in all our work that we do with governments or with authorities, whether they're local authorities or municipal authorities. It always boils down to 5 questions, 5 big questions for legislation purposes. And here they are. Here are the 5 big questions. Assuming you have your policies right, assuming you have your targets, assuming you have a government that's very willing to allow geothermal to happen, the how question comes in. How do we get this done? How do we incentivize? How do we regulate? How do we manage? How do we govern? How do we permit? How do we license geothermal? And it all boils down to 5 legal questions because, number 1, what is geothermal in legal terms? How do you define geothermal in your jurisdiction? Who owns geothermal resources? Who owns that heat that's locked in a reservoir beneath your feet? That's subsurface. Finance, tax obligations, royalties. What is it? How do they apply to my resource? What is actually being regulated? Is it water? Is it heat? Is it steam? Is it the minerals? These days, the lithium extraction from brines is, of course, very popular, but it took some legal reform to allow lithium extraction from a license that was primarily governed under the water law, the extractive water law, to extract an additional commodity out of that specific brine. In Germany, for instance, meaning that, you know, how you legislate geothermal is number 1. And how does geothermal fit into energy law? That is also a super important question to ask. A couple of explanations, because geothermal in legal terms, when we're looking at this from a renewable point of view, and don't get me wrong, there are certain countries who are still struggling to see geothermal as renewable, and they tend to place it under mineral and hence under mining because it's easier to handle according to their jurisdiction. If it's renewable, it's often classified amongst a renewable resource, like wind and solar, and hence it can receive the same premium benefits, the green and clean and low carbon benefits that wind and solar gets. When it's a water resource, all those extra premium benefits are not always automatically put on the label of geothermal because it's acted upon as a water resource, and hence you're using more the water trajectory to get your permits and not necessarily incentivize it via the Renewable Energy Act, which may allow you fast track permitting. So it does become a strategic choice for governments where to place geothermal from a legal perspective. And second, what you also see is geothermal state-owned or is it a private resource? Becomes a very important point. States can do, of course, much more than and can build broader policy packages if it's legally owned by state. But if it's legally owned by a private person, as a state, what can you do? Very important thing to realize. Who owns geothermal resources? We have a few differences, of course. Iceland, Kenya, typical state, US, but also Germany is about the landowner. So if you bought property land, you are the owner of the resource beneath your feet, and hence you have to deal with the landowner rights. Geothermal, is it subsurface? Can you get access to geothermal via subsurface rights, so like concessions? Or are you treating it as heat rights? So when you produce heat at surface, you can treat it as a heat right. Very important, who owns geothermal. Royalties. Typically, oil and gas pays royalties to the government. Geothermal does as well in certain countries. Others are more taxed by environment. For instance, you get a benefit from it because you're producing clean, firm power, and you get a benefit. So the state gets and you get a premium for that. There are also environmental fees due to reinjection. Carbon credits and incentives, if classified as renewable, it can all help to build in a financial model. And it can help boost, of course, as well, the business case for those developers. And of course, the state wants to see an income from your license or from your concession, and hence it wants to offer maybe long-term tax breaks, but a specific base, a flat fee per license area that you have to adhere to. So there are all kinds of legal, let's say, consequences and obligations that may or may not apply towards your geothermal resource. And super important and not to be neglected is the conversation on what it is actually. Is it heat, steam, water, minerals? What I tend to see is that those countries who come more from what we would call the ring of fire, obviously, the ones who are started geothermal with electricity, they focus only on electricity generation. So they have regulations, of course, in place specifically for electricity generation, but to move then and mature then away from this is still difficult. So either they rewrite packages around regulations or start basically from scratch. Others find it difficult to make multiple use per license. So if you regulate heat, how do you add minerals to it? It's hard. If you regulate minerals, how do you deal with the production of steam? And what kind of contracts are there then around steam? So this whole, let's say, thinking about geothermal as a resource, only a handful of countries do that because they have enacted upon the Geothermal Resources Act. And hence it becomes, I think, especially for emerging countries, super interesting to look at, from a legal point of view, to look at geothermal as a resource, not just as one type of utility provision. And last but not least, this is important for those who are really keen to see geothermal integrated and fitted into, let's say, some premiums, and hence can geothermal qualify for renewable energy targets? Wind and solar, why are they flying so high, literally and figuratively? Because they have very nice premium associated with policies, and hence their qualifications as renewable energy target is just superior. And for geothermal to be able to do that, we need to learn from how wind and solar manage to get themselves in the right taxonomies and in the right type of categories to qualify for these kind of targets. And I think that's a lesson that we still have to learn how to do that effectively. But also more and more important, especially for expanding governments, grid connection rules. How do you do that? How do you hook it up with multiple sources, especially in heat? That becomes very interesting to understand that geothermal forms part of a bigger pack. It's not just about geothermal, it's also about other type of renewable sources. How do you balance that? How do you incentivize that? And how do you integrate? And more importantly, especially when more and more wells are drilled, the water people, especially groundwater, are getting more and more serious about either working with us in the good way or working not so much against us, but are expressing their concerns about how geothermal can negatively impact groundwater reserves, and hence this is a space to watch and hence to carefully manage because the fresh water is of course a human right. And there's no denial that it's super important, and hence drilling in the same type of space as, and whether we go deeper or whether we're not tapping into the same aquifers, it becomes primary concern for many governments to safeguard fresh water and prioritize fresh water over geothermal. And hence how you fit in that and how you work together and how you make that one big coherent policy piece is becoming, in my mind, more and more important than ever, especially because water scarcity is driving many governments to prioritize freshwater reserves. With that, going to the regulatory frameworks, just as a repetition, but we already said to each other at the beginning, when we talk about regulatory frameworks, this is where we talk about the structured set, right? We're talking about a set of legal and procedural rules that help to get the job done. Regulations, where do they live? First and foremost, they live at the national government, obviously, because the national government sets targets, and hence the national government is always a part of the regulatory framework. But they push their let's say their regulatory their regulations into different departments or into different ministries who become principally responsible and act upon their governance role, depending on where you sit and depending on what kind of regulations needs to be enacted upon. So what you tend to see worldwide, this is just a rough sketch on how governments have structured themselves around the regulations, is that the national government pushes everything subsurface related to a Ministry of Energy or natural resources or a combination of mining and energy resources, who then have dealings with geological surveys, with the mining authorities, or any other type of subsurface authority that is capable and that's mandated to look after the subsurface. It always, Ministry of Energy in most cases have dealings and have a very good line of interaction with an independent energy market regulator, especially electricity markets. They are heavily regulated, fixed prices, the tax regime, it's all part of a very regulated market authority, and hence that regulator works together with the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources, but also of course with finance and economic affairs. So everything to do with tax, feed-in tariffs, contracts for difference, it gets pushed by national government to the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, and they also of course have to do with the independent energy market regulator to see if the job gets done. Now, environment and climate and water, they live in a different site. And our understanding, this is again, probably there are exceptions to the rule, but what we have seen is that everything water related, environment related, environmental protection related, climate incentives around green and clean gets pushed to the Ministry of Environment, and hence the Environment Protection Agency or the water authorities. They all live on this end, but they have no dealings, neither is there a direct line with the remuneration side. So the independent energy market regulator talks to finance, talks to energy and natural resources, but not so much to environment and climate, which causes for geothermal a headache, especially when you are acted upon by water law or by environmental protection law. And there are exceptions, of course, where it works really well. But in most cases, this is where the problem sits, that there is no direct dealing with different type of regulators and different type of ministries. So, in geothermal regulations, again, there is a very good split between the subsurface and what kind of markets have been designed or should be designed or want to be, in an emerging market, what kind of markets will there need to be designed? So if you look at geothermal regulations from a subsurface point of view, this is all about access and risk mitigation. It's about addressing that ownership. It's about understanding the permitting process. Where do the licenses sit? Who is issuing those licenses? Is there communication with the other side, as in the market development, the feed-in tariffs, the PPAs construct? Are they talking to each other? It's become super important when you want to integrate. And also everything to do with sustainability, health and safety, environment, it sits under access and risk mitigation, and hence the regulatory frameworks around that sits under subsurface departments. The markets, and hence how you remunerate and how you go from risk reduction to remuneration policies, sits of course in finance, in economics. They deliver on capital cost recovery. They deliver on the PPAs, open access, the pricing of heat. It all sits in the top side, if you like, and hence. To make this a little bit more tangible, part of our job, but also part of this course, is to give you some examples and advise other governments who are emerging, who are wanting to restructuring, how others have done it or how others are doing it. And in order to make regulations a little bit more, in an example, a little bit more alive, I took a look at a couple of countries that may be, of course, for you very well known, and maybe some of them are still new. So Iceland, for instance, subsurface access is public, licenses up to 65 years, and they typically have a PPA, and they have R&D funds, and it's very stable. But Iceland is, of course, just like New Zealand, it's very stable. It's very clear about geothermal. New Zealand has local councils, for instance. Licenses are variable. It's a liberalized market. Few but fast permitting when it comes down to financial incentives. Indonesia, auction, 30 plus years. PLN is, of course, the regulator that caps the pricing. You can discuss, of course, whether that's good or bad, but they cap pricing. They set PPAs with that capped price, and it's up to the developer to move on that. And Indonesia has some tax holidays, so basically tax breaks, with an import duty on that matter. Kenya, typically the government controls access. It's a very government-oriented and state-owned resource, geothermal is. It sets the PPA tariffs, 30 years licenses, very interesting steam-only bidding, very different than other countries are regulating that. Mexico was lately in the news as well. They are even going to fast-track geothermal now because they are a little bit in a standstill. Of course, there are some phenomenal projects and operators in Mexico, but still a bit of a flatliner. So they now have a clear permit path, or at least this is acting upon this year. Again, also PPA structure, tax breaks. Philippines, they have contracts with the DOE, typically very long time. They do a lot with feed-in tariffs. Japan is an interesting one because they have all kinds of overlapping laws. They are very hydro-oriented. Onsens, of course, are key. The hydro well, the aquifers and hence the hydrothermal side of geothermal is super critical, super important and critical, but not super critical, is critical to be governed and protected. Feed-in tariffs is their preferred market structure. So again, this gives an example of how different countries are basically dealing with the differences in geothermal regulations. In acting upon it by their primary act and type of market structures that they have been using. For the key takeaways for this part, before we go into a small break and then dive into a few more examples to get a little bit more clarity on how countries have been tackling certain barriers and how they resolved those barriers. The key takeaways from this part is it's all about answering the 5 big questions, because after answering those 5 big questions, you can determine your regulatory framework quite nicely. Maybe not easy, but it needs to be done. Very important also is to realize subsurface regulations govern the resource. So if you still have no regulations in place from the subsurface side, it will be very difficult to manage and regulate the service side, as in pricing, tax breaks, and tax holidays, etc. So the starting point is obviously the subsurface, but to bear in mind as well that at the end of the day, it's about understanding the market, the design of the market, and dealing with the regulatory framework on the service side is equally important. Market regulations determine the economics, and hence, although I am myself, of course, also a subsurface person, the advice that I have always been given, working now with so many different governments, the most important thing is, after, of course, having a solid answer to the 5 big questions and understanding where your subsurface regulations live, is all about the economics. So incentivizing geothermal from an economic point of view, the market design is crucial. And hence, it may be better sometimes to understand first what kind of market you would like to build, to design, and how geothermal fits in the market, instead of the other way around. With that, I would like to propose that we do a small break, and I will come back in 8 minutes. For me, that means 10 past the hour. In my case, it's 5 a.m., but 10 past the hour. So in 8 minutes, let's be back. I will resume in 8 minutes, and hope to see you then. Thank you. All right, welcome back. Thank you for joining. There are a few new people in the room, and thank you for staying. For those who just joined, we're towards the end of the conversation. So I hope you can still follow everything that we're going to discuss now. And that is a few examples of what works. And maybe also have a conversation afterwards on questions. So do type your questions if you have any, of course, in the chat, and then we can discuss everything after I am done. So in the coming 10 minutes or so, let's dive a little bit into what is typically done by others, but also what are some general observations in terms of barriers that governments or that countries or project developers see. And hence also some solutions how to mitigate or how to overcome those barriers. Early stage markets. As you can imagine, that's almost everywhere still the case, with the exception, obviously, with certain well established markets. But there are still many emerging markets. They are in their early stage. There is no real commercial project yet. There's interest. People are trying, maybe there's a grant, maybe there are a few developers active, but the key barrier often seen, and it's very general obviously, but still applicable, is this risk for drilling the first well. And that has all to do with lack of geological data, or there is no sharing of data because maybe there is some wells available, but that's typically confidential. And that means that there is limited investor confidence. It's hard to come to finance close due to that, high exploration risk. And hence, what you tend to see is that the best fit policy pack is about risk mitigation funds. It's about a public funded exploration. It's about sharing geological data, for instance, make it open and open access, or a state funds a large scale exploration campaign. This is what Türkiye did 10 years ago, with a clear target in mind of achieving over 1 gigawatt. And they realized that because the Turkish government set out a large-scale exploration campaign, drilled a lot of wells, de-risked the subsurface, went into concessions and auctions, and basically paved the way for third parties to come in and develop. And that has to do with also, of course, a willingness. There needs to be political will, but it's also about aligning targets with the right incentives and in the right policy way. Stage 2, emerging market. There are some projects, maybe even successful projects, but it doesn't really fly. It doesn't really grow. And hence what you tend to see that the barrier towards that growth is finance. It's a lack of bankability. There is still uncertainty for the long-term commitment from a policy point of view. So there's policy uncertainty. Investors want confidence that their money gets back for sure, but also it's always an assessment of the technical in combination, of course, with also the government. So a regulatory framework that is to do with stability, with commitment, that de-risk the finance, is all helping to break through that barrier of the emerging market. And hence loan guarantees, standardized PPAs, the whole charade around tax incentives. The IRA was a phenomenal, under the Biden administration, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, really helped to boost geothermal as well. Feed-in tariffs are, of course, a phenomenal measure to be done. It all helps to grow the pipeline. In a mature market, which is funny for geothermal because I don't think we are there to, we are not saturing, saturation the market, but still, in a well-established geothermal market, you probably still feel that there is some constraints, and it's not about having too much geothermal. It's probably how you integrate it, and where you fit, and hence the grid constraints. It's a fundamental point that needs to be targeted. How do you add more electrons to a grid is not always easy to realize, and hence it needs to be, let's say, it's a barrier. It's a clear barrier for growth. And hence flexible pricing, market integration, but also innovation incentives. It all helps to break through. First, some examples for countries and high enthalpy resources and how they regulate their use of geothermal. And I pick a few of them here, and of course there are plenty more examples, and we already touched upon it in the previous regulatory session. But this is again to sort of give you again an overview of best practices coming from around the world. To take Costa Rica, for instance, as a country that is purely looking at power, it regulates heat and water. It has a government-backed insurance, and it clearly looks into feed-in tariffs and tax incentives as a way to have grown their market. At the moment, Costa Rica is not doing too much. It is not considered a flat line. There is some ideas about expanding, and also what they would like to do is move beyond power into the direct utilization, and for that they need to write new regulations, and hence they have to pass a few new ideas how to regulate beyond electricity. So a clear example of a country that's moving from mature to advanced. Well, I guess New Zealand is a very obvious one. Power heat, it regulates heat and water, and it has, it has all these grants and drilling risk sharing and PPAs. We talked about Kenya already. What I find interesting with Türkiye, for instance, is they bring in the mineral because they are acted upon by the mining law. And they have, I talked to you about this just now, how they went into the 1 gigawatt target. They have a risk sharing fund. So the geothermal risk sharing fund of Turkey is quite an interesting one. And they are really good, or at least they were very good in the beginning about their feed-in tariffs. But also they have a good, let's say, set of rules around tax exemptions. Maybe on Kenya, one word is, of course, there was and still is a lot of backing from the development world, as in the World Bank, but also their public-private investment is interesting more and more. And I think now the first one is established, the third party. So basically, an international company came in. So it's not just GDC and Kengen, the national players. There's now a third party, and that means Kenya is maturing. It means that the public-private investment vehicle is working. They've reduced their risk. They are now up to the next stage, expanding their grid. And of course, much helped in the beginning by World Bank, but now a PPA between the private partner and the state is being issued, and that's all phenomenal news for expanding and advancing. And Iceland is, of course, a country that is both power and heat. It really moved beyond power to district heating from the secondary use stream of the power plants. Very much oriented towards government is backing a lot of the geothermal projects, risk insurance, exploration subsidies, but also a lot of low interest loans. It all helps to grow geothermal. I know these countries are more, let's say, focused on only heat, and I thought I threw this in anyway because more and more, I would say, diversification is going on in geothermal. Either traditional countries that were just looking at electricity are moving into low enthalpy space. So it's good to understand how countries who are just looking at low enthalpy or low temperature resources, how they are managing their regulatory and risk reduction policy. So maybe there is some shared learning here. Just to be very clear, these are 3 European countries and China. And at the moment, especially while Germany has some electricity going on in the Munich basin, but that's a very small part of it. These are countries who are just looking at geothermal through a heat lens. Which is, of course, then no surprise that their primary use and also their primary act is all centered towards using the heat directly. What they regulate is heat, so not water, not mines, extracting minerals. Germany, France, Netherlands is only regulating heat, so it's the heat in place that they regulate. And hence their whole risk reduction is about getting that heat out of the ground and delivering heat to the customer. China has taken a different approach because it also wants to regulate water. And that's not how the European countries have been dealing with it. So a couple of points on those countries. How do they get through their first wells, and how did they get to the point where they are now? Insurance, very key for Germany. There's a very strong risk insurance industry around drilling those wells in Germany, but also the state incentivizes getting data and getting a lot of research, well, not so just companies, R&D in companies, but also state, the geological surveys, the universities, they all work together to produce on regular basis the data sets required from the subsurface in open access way, because Germany traditionally is a very confidential proprietary data as proprietary, and hence there was no risk, no data sharing, and hence they targeted that. The France is growing their heat market through tax breaks a lot. The Dutch, they are giving subsidies for drilling, basically to overcome the hurdle of the first well. There are all kinds of incentives for drilling, but also there is now some upcoming talks about fast tracking because it's clear that the projects get stuck in the permitting stage. When it comes down to remuneration policies, they all seem to be around subsidies, carbon pricing, low interest loans, but also, in the Netherlands, we are very specific because we have gas. It needs to be phased out. So heat networks that deliver clean, green heat are favoritized over, so basically a carbon pricing on the gas heated networks. So it all helps to stimulate. China is, of course, a very state-oriented country, also heat and hence power, but in this case, geothermal heat is in the public space. But they do have a public-private investment model, and they're looking a lot around state-backed pricing to keep prices low, but also still make an affordable, let's say, business model out of it, with a lot of subsidies to sort of incentivize the first geothermal projects. But now they are very mature, and China is going beyond China and really looking into, moving and advancing geothermal, especially heating and cooling around the world. With that, I think we have come to an end. First of all, thank you, and also for this is quite intense. I hope you have learned a lot. but also just to preempt the overkill of information, the jargon, the definitions. As I said, I have a glossary prepared to look all the terms that I've been using over the past hour and a half. What I'll do is, for everyone who registered, you will get the PowerPoint pack as a PDF slide pack that has the glossary. That has the glossary in there as well for looking into all the different terms and names and definitions. With that, I think it's time to move to questions. If you have any, so let me quickly look at the chat. Yes, I see a few. Maybe the last one is the easiest. Thank you. Can we have this PowerPoint? Yes, of course. What I'll do is afterwards, I will send it around to those registered participants in a PDF so you can have a look. All right. Two questions. Regulatory strategies have been used to deal with conflicts or potential conflict between different sectors trying to access the same real estate. In hot settlement with cash flow versus water use. Yeah. Second was regulatory policies have been used to facilitate transfer of assets. Yeah, and how about Ethiopia sitting on active coin and less risk what it needs in this perspective? Okay, very nice questions. Maybe an easy one first. Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is very active in geothermal. Of course, there are a few projects on the way. I have understood that it is not easy due to currently the situation in, so the political situation in Ethiopia is not easy. So a couple of projects have been put on hold, with developers even moving out of the country. But as far as I know, the two projects that have been drilled, Tulumoya and the other name has just escaped my mind. But they have found phenomenal resources. So the resources are there. It's clear that there is Aluto, that was the other one. It's clear that the resources are there. The wells are drilled. I think the challenge is to hook it to the grid. But my understanding is that that's also to do with some instability in the region. And what needs to be done in this perspective? I'm not sure about the regulatory framework in Ethiopia, but I can imagine that there is still some work to be done in order to expand. But let's look into that in a separate way. Okay, Mark, a very interesting question. It's good to have you, of course, in the course. Yeah, what regulatory strategies have been used to deal with conflicts or potential between different sectors trying to access the same real estate? So, if I interpret your question in the right way, the conflict sits with phasing out one over the other. It's not about integration. And if I take the example of how, for instance, Europe is dealing with this, it has to build in the real estate. It has built in the so-called green code, meaning that especially for the new build environment, as in everything that is now, let's say, being built, it can only be sourced through green and low carbon energies. And of course, earmarked is when it comes down to electricity, solar and wind. So the grid has to be proven to be clean and green, fair enough. But also everything to do with heat pumps or shallow geothermal, such as everything beneath 500 meters is less permitting and less licenses, is all earmarked as fast tracked. And the codes have been used in order to incentivize green and clean over fossil fuel. But that is for new building. I guess your question also comes from how do you phase out existing real estate? And that is not easy. of course, I do not know your situation, and we can have a deeper discussion on this. But what I see here is that there are two ways to approach this. One is collectively, the other one is independently. Independently, it's a choice of the owner. And if the owner has a choice, it takes the cheapest. Let's be very clear. And hence, geothermal has to prove it's cheaper than the alternative. And that is, in most cases, only over a longer period of time doable. Collectively, that's a government push. That those are the right, let's say, incentives to be in place in order to phase out collectively the alternative. And what you see there is subsidies like heat-in tariffs. In most cases, it's about heating, so not feed-in tariffs for electricity premium, but heat-in tariffs, and giving renewable energy priority. And yeah, but that's an infrastructure thing, and that's not always easy. Transfer of assets from one use to another, depleted. Yes, so this is under the Circular Energy Act, or under the transfer of rights. What I have seen so far is whether it's depleted or whether it is end of life, predominantly repurposing gas wells is becoming more and more popular. Not only the license area for geothermal, but also, for instance, for offshore for wind. It's the same principle. It's extending the life. So exploration is done, production, they are all production licenses. And towards the end of the production license, the state has a choice, either to basically go into decommission, so basically kill the production and decommission the wells, or extend the life of the license under the premium of renewable energy. So for wind, it's all about electricity. For geothermal, it is a hard one still, because in most cases the heat is not hot enough to produce electricity, and hence what you tend to see, what has helped enormously in I take France as an example, is to extend the life of the license and to produce as a trial green heat out of the repurposed license towards neighboring community, like a greenhouse and a small farm and whatever, to prove the point of the extension. And when that was successful, the government took it up and extended the life of a few other licenses as well, but still at no price. So the biggest hurdle is not the subsurface hurdle, is the market hurdle. So how do you price heat in an extended life? And I think they solved it now by putting a pricing incentive on the heat sales, but I'm not sure about that. So yeah, interesting point. It's not common practice yet. So if you have any examples out of Australia, I would be very keen to hear what your thoughts are. South America, policies and regulations in South America. Well, South America is quite large. Maybe to refine a few things. So Colombia is on the rise when it comes down to geothermal. It's actively looking into both power and heating, so the direct utilization. They're targeting power first and then direct use. The policies are all about the Renewable Energy Act. It's all about getting more clean power to Colombia, and hence it's also put under CO2 reductions. The upcoming countries in the Andes region, Ecuador, Bolivia, and all the way to Chile, of course, who has an existing act on renewable energy. They're still very early stage. I'm not sure what exactly you want to know in depth, but we can have a private or offline conversation on this. But yeah, it's upcoming, and even Argentina and Brazil are looking into geothermal, drilling some wells and having a go at how to regulate it. So it's all early stage and emerging, but very promising, very promising. Can they coexist? Yes, yes, yes. But the problem is, the problem, yes, Mark, they can coexist, but the problem is that the license, so the mining authorities who issue the licenses, they are not necessarily interested in doing anything else than getting their royalties out of gas or oil. And hence the heat or water, whatever it is that you're producing at the end of the life, is not easy to regulate. And hence there you have to be still creative, and creative and regulations do not always match very well, and hence the coexisting is exactly the problem. It is either end of life and the one phases the other one out, and hence you move gradually over by an extension. But coexisting is not easy because they apply to different type of the legislation is different for oil or mineral resources under the Mining Act, and geothermal sitting under, for instance, the Heat Act or the Water Act, and hence these two don't match. So it's not just about what is it that you regulate, it's about under which law did you pertain and do you comply with the license, and this is what makes it so hard. Graham patrolling objecting to the granting overlapping therefore because of reverse protecting. Okay, yeah, okay, that's another point. In the ideal world, we all share data, but this is a very good point. That is the private sector that is pushing back. I get that. That's happening everywhere, and I think not to the benefit of geothermal. That India also drafted geothermal policy and finalize. We can. Yes, India, very good. Yes, yes. 2016, I did not know that, but India has been lately very active, also with some direct utilization. So very keen to take this together. Yeah, thank you as well. Yeah, look, Mark, I think this is a very interesting point. I bet this is Australia. So because this sounds very specific, also with Graham answering to this. Yeah, yeah, okay. Because of a worry about yeah. Okay, anyway, we can take this also together. And when I visit you guys in Australia, we can definitely talk about this. Okay, I think this is it. Thank you, thank you. Unless there is one more question, I think, yes, please. Yes, Mark, so looking forward. All right, with that, yes, well, thank you all for joining. As I said, the whole presentation, including the glossary with all the terms and definitions, will be sent to you. Feel free to give me any feedback that is that you think you can give me, send to me by email. Would be happy to take also further conversations, whether that's on India or South America or Ethiopia. Do not hesitate to reach out. But for now, I wish you a splendid day. Thank you for joining and hope to see you all soon. Thank you.